Throughout this series, we have covered numerous topics that are significant to the upcoming presidential election. Hopefully, you've learned things about Dr. Paul that you did not know before. But most importantly, I hope you've learned something about the biblical view of government. Our nation is at a crossroads. We face critical decisions that will either improve our situation or worsen our situation. Thankfully, God has revealed to us His wisdom for civil affairs. As we vote for candidates for the GOP nomination, let us not ignore that wisdom and pretend that politics is devoid of moral principles. Civil rulers will lead based on their moral convictions. Those convictions will either be in line with God's word or they will not be. The duty of the Christian voter is to find the candidate that is most in line with biblical principles. I believe that candidate in 2012 is Congressman Ron Paul. His consistent voting record for more than 30 years proves that he is genuine and reliable. Paul is not an infallible candidate. He is not exempt from error, and he is certainly no Messiah. No candidate is. The only way this nation will experience true progress is when the church reclaims its God-given task and the hearts of the people are converted. Political activism is only a secondary step. But when it comes to every major issue, Paul is the candidate most aligned with the Bible. Of the other viable candidates, who else talks about what the role and limits of government should be? Who else talks about honest money and ending the Federal Reserve? Who else proposes real spending cuts to solve our debt crisis? Who else calls for a defensive-only war policy? Who else supports free trade across all borders? Who else wants you to keep the fruits of your labor? And who else has a practical solution for ending abortion? At almost every point, the other candidates show themselves to be miles away from biblical principles. Perhaps you've heard the following arguments against supporting Paul. He's too kooky, he's too old, he's not presidential enough, he's unelectable, and he cannot beat Obama. These reasons for not supporting Paul are superficial, with no credible evidence. Paul's views aren't kooky, unless by kooky you mean biblical. And doesn't the Bible teach us to not look down on people for their age? We've been electing status quo politicians for years, and look where it has gotten us. Perhaps it is time for America to reconsider its perception of what presidential qualities are. Maybe we should put focus on the policies and beliefs of politicians rather than catchy one-liners and celebrity personalities. The argument that Paul is unelectable is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course he will never win as long as we refuse to vote for him. Such claims also ignore the facts. At the time of this filming, Paul has won 15 presidential straw polls and is a top-tier candidate in the early primary states. Statistically speaking, Paul is just as electable, if not more, than anyone else. Paul is also the candidate most likely to beat Obama in the general election. Of all the GOP candidates, Paul gains most support among independents and third-party members, not to mention anti-war Democrats. A Republican victory in 2012 cannot be accomplished with Republican voters alone. We will need all the help we can get. But he cannot beat Obama unless he wins the GOP nomination. If he doesn't win the nomination, fine. But the least we can do is give him the chance. Be diligent to vote in your state's primary. If you live in a closed state, make sure you're a registered Republican so you can vote for Paul. The primary vote may be the most important vote you make. This series is not intended to be an exhaustive defense of Paul. I encourage you to take what you've learned here and continue researching on your own. I trust that you will find Ron Paul to be the champion of the Constitution, the defender of the unborn, the taxpayer's best friend, and the only candidate for peace. He just so happens to be the most biblical.